David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I wasn't really planning to do a segment about this, but there have been so many bad takes coming from, I guess, what we're calling the revolutionary left. That's the non-pejorative term that we've, I guess, agreed on to describe them, about the resignation of Bolivian President Evo Morales, that I feel compelled to discuss it because the right is just completely uninformed about Latin American politics. So I really don't have any message for them. But there are a lot of people on the left that are either misunderstanding or just wrong in their conclusions about what has taken place in Bolivia over the last close to 15 years, calling it in completely black and white terms a military coup. So my goal here is to go through the whole story. Hopefully this will be enlightening. I know I'll be called a shill and all of this stuff, but who cares, right? I mean, we get one shot at doing things the way we actually see them. You only live once, and I'm going to do the stories with the nuance that I think they deserve, because that's really what's missing. The problem is there is too much black and white thinking in general in politics. People are either good or bad. The military is either good or bad. Socialism is either good or bad. A politician is either a savior or a villain. And I know lots of people who work in the field of mental health, and they tell me, you know, a lot of the people that come in that I see, they have in their lives all sorts of different things going on that at their root are often caused by black and white thinking about gray areas in life, about jobs, about relationships, about their childhood, whatever. And I believe that the same is happening in politics and specifically with the Bolivia situation. So let's try to put that aside. Let's just all talk like reasonable people. No one's shilling here. Some people may be missing some of the facts. Some people may be coming to conclusions that are tinged by ideology. Let's not make these umbrella black and white declarations, and let's try to actually figure out what's going on. So the Bolivian president, Evo Morales, was first in office in 2006. A few days ago, he resigned at the request or demand of the Bolivian military. And request or demand we can argue about, but it's not actually the most important thing. Why did this happen? A few days ago, there has been rampant speculation about the most recent election being a bogus election. The Organization of American States put out a report saying that the election results were manipulated, including alterations, forced signatures, and wide-scale data manipulation. Now, there is already a debate about this. Well, does that mean the election was bogus, or are these just reports of irregularities like you have in many elections, including here in the United States? But for me, the real story is actually bigger than this. And I want to ask you this hypothetical. If Donald Trump, during his second term, imagine he gets reelected in November and he gets a second term. Imagine that during that second term, Donald Trump changed the Constitution to allow a third term effective immediately, but then also claimed that since the Constitution was changed, his second term is sort of really his first term under the new Constitution. So he should actually get two more. And then during the third term, which is really his fourth, he loses a referendum to allow unlimited terms. And then his Supreme Court justices that he has selected say, forget about the term limits. You can stay as long as you want. Wouldn't we in that situation, as progressives who are for the rule of law, wouldn't we be begging someone to force Donald Trump out? Okay. Now let's talk about what happened in Bolivia. Evo Morales was elected in 2006, and people were excited because there were good things about his election. It's not black and white. He was the first ethnically indigenous president of Bolivia. That's great in a country that has such a large indigenous population. Why did it take so long to have an indigenous president? Fantastic, lovely. He reduced poverty during his first term. He offered a much more sensible and pragmatic version of the socialism that has been espoused by Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. He invested in infrastructure and development and grew the middle class. Great. But like with many of these Latin American socialists of the last many decades, he's increasingly authoritarian. There's corruption. He was elected to a 5-year term in 2006. He got a new constitution adopted while he was president, which allowed 2 terms. Then in 2009, he called for early elections, won, and said, hey, this is sort of really like my first term because I didn't complete the first term under the old constitution. We have a new constitution, so I should really be able to run again in 2014. It's not objectively bad to change a constitution, but one should not be allowed to stay in office longer than they were originally supposed to because of changes made under their watch. That's what authoritarians do. So this is already bad. He wins that early 2009 election, calls it his first term. So now he's allowed to run again in 2014. And a court increasingly under his control says, yes, he is allowed to run again. This will count as his second term, not as his third, or his first term, not as his second. He barely wins in 2014 and then says, well, let's do a referendum to abolish term limits altogether so that I can just continue being reelected and reelected indefinitely. Voters reject that referendum in Bolivia. So what does he do? He appeals once again to a constitutional court filled with people loyal to him who say, yep, you know what? Running for office is a human right in Bolivia. Term limits violate the human rights of Evo Morales, so he can run again, which he does, and wins in an election determined to have significant irregularities, some characterizing it as completely bogus. So listen, do I want the military to take control of the country now? Hell no. I'm from Argentina. I know what happens when the military takes control. It's bad. Is this a black-white military coup? No. That's an extraordinarily myopic interpretation that completely ignores history in Bolivia for the last 13 years. If an American president did 25% of what Morales did in the election system in Bolivia, we'd all be demanding their removal. You'll hear comments like, well, this all happened because American banking and finance has ruined these countries, including Bolivia. How does that force a president to change the Constitution to remain in power longer? And how does it excuse it? These things are not as cut and dry as the revolutionary left is making them out to be. So my request to you is don't fall for the black and white thinking. And of course, the revolutionary left will say anyone who is not loudly opposed to this is a pro-military coup, pro-American interventionist Yankee shill. Let's be adults, guys. Give me a break. The world is not black and white the way you make it out. Evo Morales did some good things early in his presidency. He also is corrupt. We are also seeing a lot of the same things happen in Bolivia that we have seen happen in other places in Latin America, like Venezuela and others, when these authoritarian-leaning socialists remain in power for longer and longer periods of time. Now, interestingly, the left and right share the existence of these factions who suffer from black and white thinking. On the right, you have these libertarians and small government people who think their black and white principles tell them everything they need to know. On the left, you've got the revolutionary left who suffers from, a version of the same affliction where they see a situation and they say, oh yeah, the military's involved, so that's bad. And a socialist is the president and that's good. And he's an ethnic minority. So that's it. That's the analysis. And anything else is completely unacceptable. You're pushed out if you don't fall in line with that ideology. Tell me all the ways I'm wrong on the facts. I'm ready for it. But let's not play these just completely toxic black and white games that unfortunately are happening among a contingent of the left. I've been telling you for some time that the damage Donald Trump is doing in the U.S. is going to outlast his presidency. And this is true both in terms of the practical and the ideological. So as an example, the way in which Trump has coarsened political language and what counts as discourse is going to outlast Donald Trump. That won't be fixed when Trump leaves office. But a more practical example is that things like the alliances with other countries that Trump has ruined will take longer to fix than Donald Trump's tenure in office. It could take years after Trump is gone to repair those alliances with other countries, with international institutions and working groups. David Frum, a traditional conservative, I guess we'd call him, he was a speechwriter for George W. Bush. He wrote an article about exactly this in The Atlantic called America After Trump. And he points out a lot of the ways in which Trump's damage to America is going to last longer than his presidency. One example is, even though Republicans before Trump have won the Electoral College without winning the popular vote, Trump lost the popular vote by the biggest margin in history while still winning the Electoral College in 2016. That's likely to happen again if Trump gets reelected in 2020. And the more that that losing margin is in the popular vote while still winning the electoral, Frum argues, will call into question the legitimacy of our political system. And I agree, and I've been talking about the Electoral College for a long time. And Frum goes on to say, if Trump loses narrowly in 2020, the 40% of the country that likes him is likely to turn into organized violence, which will be destructive to our country's social fabric for a very long time. Maybe Trump will try to get the military involved to keep him in office because he feels that he was cheated. Now, the military is not going to do that, but simply a president publicly pushing for that would be disastrous for the country, and it would allow Trump to keep harming the United States beyond November of 2020. Now, if Trump loses big, as David Frum says, the possibility of Democrats fixing everything and quickly is really slim, and we have to recognize that. There is going to be a lot to fix. And unfortunately, the reality is that this takes a long time. Even a much more left-wing president than we've ever had before, if it's Bernie, if it's Warren, they're not going to be able to do everything and fix everything in 4 years. And this will potentially make people even more disaffected with the political system because they'll say, look, Trump was terrible, but we got him out and we put in Bernie or Warren, and they barely fixed anything because it's, of course, much easier to break things than it is to build them, as we know. And then there are things David Frum doesn't talk about in his piece. I've talked about the justice system, the judiciary, the damage done by Donald Trump's Supreme Court and lower court justice and judge selections is already disgusting, and it will continue, and it will persist for a long time because those are positions for life, and they are going to outlast Trump by a lot. The damage of the environmental regulations that were rolled back or skipped may never be undone. And every day we fall further and further behind where we could be. We don't make progress. We don't deal with the environmental issue. That's by design. This is what they want, but it will damage the country long beyond Donald Trump's presidency. This is just a partial list, but the idea is to really make clear that we do not fix the problems merely by getting rid of Trump. That's like 1A, the prerequisite to start thinking about all of the things that will need to be fixed. There are people on the left who recognize it. There are people on the right, like David Frum, who recognize it. And we all need to understand that the removal of Trump in 2020 is not the solution. It's merely step one in starting to repair things. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. Follow me there. We'll take a quick break and be back right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Brian Coffey and Maximus Trajan. Brian and Maximus, thank you so much for your support. And I also want to say thanks to Eric Kirsnowski, who is today's longtime sustainer of the day, a member for almost 5 years. Join up at joinpakman.com. Support the show. I really appreciate it. One of the things that we've been talking about is how the political discourse has coarsened under Donald Trump. But the roots of this actually predate Trump by quite a bit. Yeah, Trump is the anti-intellectual president. He's coalesced one of the least educated and most uninformed elements of the electorate for his benefit. But that was already starting to happen under George W. Bush. Decrying education as liberal indoctrination has gone back for a while. Republicans have known for a long time that when people learn critical thinking and epistemology, they are way less likely to vote Republican. So they've rooted out those subjects from public school curricula in many states where they've taken control of the boards of education. But there's an element of this that goes beyond simply anti-intellectualism, which is that trolling has become considered legitimate political discourse. Yes, xenophobic talking points are considered political discourse under Trump. Yes, the stuff that people like Ben Shapiro and Charlie Cork do at college is considered political discourse now. But straight up trolling is also considered political discourse now. So trolling, just so we can define it, trolling is deliberately posting or saying the most inflammatory, extraneous, or off-topic thing that you can in a discussion. So rather than participating in the discussion in good faith, you're effectively derailing the conversation, sowing discord, trying to cause disagreements or arguments, or even just getting people to give up participating in the conversation altogether. And there's a really good piece in Wired by Jonathan Albright who says, trolling is now considered mainstream political discourse. The Overton window of acceptable behavior in political conversations and discourse has been widened to include, as if it were legitimate, overt trolling. There's a really good study of social media messages, which finds that over time, more and more, the messages posted about political issues and about candidates are messages that are sort of a mix of hate speech, harassment, amplifying unproven rumors and conspiracies, spreading fake news, swarming and dogpiling people, and just direct attacks, character assassinations, and insults. The number of comments about politics that are meant to inspire action, like voting or activism, contacting elected officials, those are diminishing more and more. Now, this is true on the left and right. We don't have to argue in what proportion. The right is much more a purveyor of fake news, much more a purveyor of conspiracy theories. There's no question about that. The trolling is mixed, but we don't have to debate who does it more because it hurts the left more. That's the reality. The right wins when fewer people vote. The right wins when fewer people are engaged. If more and more of the discussion is the type that makes people like voting is pointless, like their voice is irrelevant, that they become frustrated and they bail out, the right wins. When the algorithms and the filter bubbles keep people in their own circles, except for vicious attacks and hate speech and insults, so that people do nothing instead of be active. So they watch Netflix instead of be politically active. The oligarchs and the billionaire class get their way because others are bailing out. That's why I say we're at a disadvantage. We want to do things and they want to keep things the same. We want to do things. They want no one to get involved so that they can basically maintain the status quo while perpetuating the inequality cycles that we've been seeing. By creating gridlock and despair and apathy, they win. So we have to overcome that and we have to do stuff. And this is one of the ways in which the Trump era will have destructive effects well beyond his presidency, however long it ends up lasting. Earlier, we dealt with some of the other ways that Donald Trump is going to have a destructive effect on the United States well beyond his presidency. This is one of those ways, and it is that trolling and all sorts of other horrible stuff are actually considered political discourse and a way to discuss political issues and figure out who we want to vote for. That is extraordinarily destructive. And one of the great insulators against this, there are many, but one of the great insulators against this is a more educated population, a population who understands critical thinking and epistemology, as we talked about yesterday in that segment, interviewing a group of uneducated, white, swing state female voters. Go back and check that one out if you missed it. I've been telling you for weeks and months that as the pressure mounts around Donald Trump, he will become more erratic and desperate and panicked. And the public-facing expression of this panic is very likely to be tweets, endless tweets, tons of tweets. And we're seeing it. Donald Trump tweeted 82 times on Saturday, 82 times. This makes his 10-tweet rants of 6 months ago seem comparatively sane and sober. Now, what is triggering Trump? Impeachment, including the public impeachment inquiry hearings starting tomorrow, which we'll be streaming live on our YouTube channel. The continued incompetence and corruption of the people around Trump, including Rudy and Sean Hannity and many others. Trump realizing that tens of millions of people want him out and they want him out now. Trump has been heavily triggered. And we're going to look at a few of those tweets shortly. We're not going to look at anywhere close to 82. But some of the themes include insulting House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff, tweeting about him 11 times. Trump, of course, likes to claim presidential harassment against himself, but tweeting 11 times about one congressman, it sort of sounds like presidential harassment by the president rather than of the president. The whistleblower mentioned 11 times, some version of impeachment mentioned 9 times. Let's take a look at some of Trump's tweets. A lot of them were actually retweets of various Fox News segments that Trump determined are favorable to him. Sometimes they featured Sean Hannity or others. Then there were actual tweets that Donald Trump wrote, like, for example, quote, "But the witch hunt continues. After 3 years of relentless attacks against the Republican Party and me, the do-nothing Dems are losers for America. One tweet was filled with nicknames, Trump saying, quote, "I recommend that nervous Nancy Pelosi, who backed up Schiff's lie, shifty Adam Schiff, sleepy Joe Biden, and the whistleblower who miraculously disappeared after I released the transcript of the call, the second whistleblower who also disappeared, and the IG be part of the list." Another tweet about the whistleblower and witch hunt saying, quote, "Whatever happened to the so-called informer to whistleblower number one seems to have disappeared after I released the capital T transcript of the call. Shouldn't he be on the list to testify? Witch hunt." And then, of course, the old stalwart, presidential harassment in all capital letters, which his followers just love, that one getting 125,000 likes. This is a tiny fraction of what Trump did just on Saturday, 82 tweets. How does he have this much time? I mean, I guess he's barely doing anything else, and maybe that's a good thing. But aside from the content of Donald Trump's tweets, which are particularly embarrassing and erratic, one would never imagine that a president would have time to tweet 82 times in one day about anything. If you take the job seriously and you read briefings and history and nonfiction and do all of the things that many other presidents have done, you don't have time for this stuff. Now, as much as Barack Obama read and researched, by the way, he still made mistakes on the job. So how does Trump even possibly stand a chance if he spends his days tweeting? And of course, once again, is the drug issue in the background of this. This type of manic, over-the-top behavior, also common among abusers of stimulants. Donald Trump, according to some who were behind the scenes on The Apprentice, snorts Adderall. He's been pictured with a stack of Sudafed in his desk at Trump Tower, which can also be crushed up and used in ways similar to Adderall. Tweeting 82 times in a day is another sign that is making people wonder about stimulant abuse, because it is not normal behavior. Never mind, by the way, that he says he only sleeps 4 hours per day and often is tweeting in the middle of the night. More signs of stimulant use, or maybe better said, abuse of stimulants. Make sure you follow The David Pakman Show on Instagram for continued coverage of Trump's tweets at David Pakman Show. While you're there, I ask you humbly, follow me on Instagram as well at david.pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Megan Phelps-Roper, who is author of the book Unfollow, A Journey from Hatred to Hope, Leaving the Westboro Baptist Church. As the book's title implies, Megan is a former member of the Westboro Baptist Church. Megan, so great to have you on. I'm glad we finally were able to do this.
Finally, I feel like we've been talking by email since I was still a member of the church. So this is the first time we've actually spoken, I think.
Yeah. And for people, so people may remember that years ago, I interviewed some other folks from the Westboro Baptist Church, some who are biological relatives of yours, some who are not, and who maybe we will talk about. But for people who aren't familiar with you, what your childhood in Kansas, what was it like? What's your first sort of memory of the Westboro Baptist Church as what others kind of know it to be?
I was 5 years old when we first started protesting at a park about half a mile from, my house. I lived on the block that we shared with the church and several other family members. There was a fence enclosing that whole area. So for me, that space was a refuge. It was filled with people that I loved and who loved me. And then we would go out to these protests, like I said, starting at this local park and then branching out from there to be basically, everywhere outside of the church, anywhere outside the church was a legitimate target for our protests. And so we would go out there and, obviously there was a lot of hatred on our signs. We would say that it was the hatred of God, not our own personal human hatred. But the hatred that was reflected back at us was ferocious. People driving their cars at us, throwing things, coming after us on foot. It was not an uncommon thing for a long time. So these are my earliest memories on the picket line.
As far as you were concerned, the things that you were protesting were. And I mean, I guess the reason I asked that is the outward facing side. If people are familiar with the protests, they would say, well, these are homophobic protests. These are protests that sometimes are against the military. They're religiously based protests. But like, how did you conceive of them from inside?
We saw it as loving our neighbor. We were going to warn people of the consequences of their sins, which was an inherently loving thing, according to our understanding of the Bible. I was not an incurious person. I was not, as long as if we did anything, there had to be a justification from the Bible. And as long as there was, I was trained to believe that that was the infallible word of God, and it was unquestionable. And I had to go along with it. Any thought or feeling or doubt that I had was indicative of a problem with me, not with the doctrine or with Westboro itself.
Now, as you've talked about, the fact that you were doing this from such a young age, and maybe this became more of an issue not when you were 5, but maybe more like 8, 9, 10, you had to start dealing with the reaction from people in the community, at least to some degree. Were you sort of like prepared by others in the church for that to happen? And what was the kind of preparation that you were given, or the defense that you were given?
Yeah, we were absolutely prepared. And it was something that we talked about this every single day. It looks like, sitting around our living room I'm the third of 11 kids. So we would spend, time every evening reading the Bible, memorizing Bible verses. Honestly, being on the picket itself was preparation, on the picket line itself, because, there you're encountering people who obviously strongly disagreed with our message. And some were willing to articulate their positions in arguments. And so we had to be ready always, and that's the Bible verse, be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you a reason for the hope that's in you with meekness and fear. So it was something that we took deadly serious. And I did too. Because we knew that the whole world was against our message, we needed to be ready, with Bible verses, in hand, memorized. You can't, pull out a Bible and start looking things up when you're standing there and somebody's yelling in your face. You have to be ready immediately to give it, to both to exhort and to confute the gainsayers, as my gramps would say, quoting the Bible, of course.
And when this happened, and when people would either challenge you on the substance of the protests, or sometimes, of course, it was not about the substance necessarily, but it was you are all terrible people. You're doing something that's horrible. You're hurting other people. Do you recall that as being traumatic in some sense, or had you been so prepared for it and sort of equipped for it that you did not feel it, at least at the time, as a traumatic event?
I did not experience it as a traumatic event. And in fact, I remember a moment early on when we were going to a protest that seemed like it was going to be particularly acrimonious and possibly even dangerous. And I was really small. And I remember, and maybe I was just being melodramatic, I was probably 5 or 6. And I kind of whimpered a little bit. And, I think it was my mom who was like, basically, cut that out. Like, the Lord is with us. I experienced, when people would accuse us of being hateful, like, I knew that my intentions were not hateful. I knew that I was trying to do the right thing, Gramps would say that, the world needs this message more than they need food to eat, air to breathe, or water to drink. And, again, I believed that. And so when I basically just felt misunderstood. These people are making all these accusations, but that's just because they don't understand. God has blinded them. Really, we're the good guys, and they just don't get it.
And you, at least at this point that we're talking about right now, you were 110% behind that as the interpretation of what was going on. At this point, there was not the doubt that later started to surface.
Right, absolutely. I was all in.
At this point, and when we talk about, when I say your family, people may not know, your mom is Shirley Phelps Roper, and then Fred Phelps, your grandfather. Was your family sort of loving and other than this, which to the outside appears to be a really horrible thing to expose a kid to, but from the perspective from within the church, it was a loving thing to warn people and to save people. Other than that, Is your experience now, having seen the way other people were raised and live in the world, was it one of sort of like a loving household in the traditional stereotypical ways?
I would say there's two parts to it. There is absolutely, it was full of love and care, and I think of my parents, and the I'm overwhelmed with those positive memories and the time that we spent together. And yes, absolutely, reading, I mean, other than the Bible, even reading together, my dad would, the way that my dad did bedtime when I was a kid. I mean, it just all these, wonderful memories. But then of course, that hard line biblical stance that we took toward outsiders, that absolutely applied to us inside as well. We were held to an extremely high particular set of standards, and any deviation from that was cause for punishment. And when I was younger, that absolutely included physical punishment, and I would even say abuse. It wasn't every single time, but it absolutely did, frequently enough veer into abuse, at least in my family. And I know that it was, that what I experienced was far less extreme even than what my mom and her generation experienced.
Right.
So there was that side of it. And there was, the absolute terror that you feel, of going to hell, of what God is going to do to you if you don't 100% toe the line on everything. When I say everything, I really mean everything. It could come down to a look on your face or a tone in your voice. Those kinds of things could get you into deep trouble. And it's one of those things that, since I left, the relief that I feel at not having this sort of constant attribution of ill motives for, any possible, it just seemed like by the time I left, my sister Grace left with me. By the time we left, the way we would describe it, we would say, everything that looks bad is bad, and everything that looks good is also bad. It's just there is this wonderful sense of, I'm sorry, I'm going on here, but like there's an amazing sense of community and togetherness, in groups like Westboro. But there's also the understanding, the high cost of deviation of any sort.
So you and Grace eventually left, but let's build up to that. Yeah. First of all, by the time you started experiencing some doubts or questions, I would love for you to tell us when that was and what prompted it. But were there other siblings or cousins or whoever that had also already left at that point?
Yes. So my brother Josh, he left when I was 18 and he was 19. Okay. So he was the first person close to me who left the church. I had heard about my, siblings of my mother's, who had left, and they were just understood to be hellbound and hated by God and just essentially disposable. Like, you understand that people who leave they're disposable. They're not our family anymore. There's a passage where Jesus says, "Who is my mother and who are my brethren? These that do the will of God." So the people in the church were a family, and everyone outside of that was not.
Right.
So, and yes, I mean, so there were others. There were other cousins who had left as well. And so I had these examples, but they were not. You don't take them as an example to follow. You take them as an example of what you want to avoid. There's actually almost the opposite effect. It's not something like when somebody leaves that's close to you. You don't feel like you want to follow them. You feel like you want to, you need to prove yourself. It's almost like you throw yourself even more deeply into the work of the church to prove that you're not like them.
That's interesting. Was there an air, did you feel as though when someone would leave that there would be an air of suspicion that would be upon you and others?
Yeah. Yeah. And not just suspicion, but just worry, know, and I needed to show people that, in fact, I went and looked up, when my cousin Libby left, I had been, pretty close to her, and I went and looked up, the email that I sent, afterwards to the whole church, basically, feeling the need to say bad things about her and to show that I was not on the same page with her rebellion. So yeah, you asked a question though about.
Yeah. So that's it. I mean, so that gets us to what you had observed in terms of people separating while you were still there. And I mean, I guess I want to hear a little bit about what started the questions and
Yeah.
the doubts and the sort of looking into other worldviews.
Right. So I got on Twitter in 2009. And I didn't go on Twitter because I was looking to have my mind changed. I got on Twitter to spread Westboro's message. It was
And I
just
think I
another
remember
place.
when that happened, in fact. And correct me if I'm wrong, it wasn't just you, but there were a couple of your sisters who were maybe also doing the same?
I was the only one tweeting publicly for a while.
Okay.
I feel like it was maybe about a year, something like that.
Yeah.
And then, yes, absolutely, a bunch more people got on. My mom got on. She was at Dear Shirley. Margie, yeah, and then I think some of my uncles and others also. So yeah, when I got on, I wasn't trying to. I was just trying to show other people why they were wrong, and how. But over time, several things happened. There were a lot of things about Twitter that were really powerful to me. First of all, like the first thing, and this was I think the one thing that I was conscious of, was that with only 140 characters, there wasn't space for the kind of insults that we just, threw around all the time. Like, I don't know if you remember that era, but it was constant.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when Margie called me a titmouse, which might have had some, I mean, that one's pretty short and pithy, but a lot of them were much more involved and required, sort of being able to be a little bit more verbose.
Yes, and so my mom, every time she would, because like George W. Bush was the president at the time, so she would say, bombastic, blowhard, big mouth bastard.
Right.
And so like there just wasn't space for that on Twitter. And then I realized that even when there was space, even when I did make the space for it, I would watch the conversation immediately just go off the rails. And we're no longer talking about this theological point that I feel is so important. Now it's this person being defensive because I've called them a stupid name.
Right.
And so, I learned not to do that. That was the first kind of step, I think, for me away. But I mean, that was just a slightly different communication style.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that opened the door to at least interacting with people in a different way. You still have your view. They still have theirs. They're wrong. You're right. But at least the method of communication has shifted a little bit.
Slightly, exactly. Yeah. But then, but one of the first people that I attacked when I got on Twitter was this guy, David Abitbol, who ran a blog called Jewlicious. And, I only attacked him because he was Jewish, because, Jews killed Jesus.
Sure.
As you know.
As I've been told many times.
Right. And so anyway, so he initially responded like many other people, just like full of hostility. And then, but pretty quickly he recognized, he said later, he recognized that I was sincere and that he thought it was important to articulate, why have we as a society rejected messages like Westboro's? For the people who were following both of us, who would see both of us, he thought it was important to offer a counterpoint. So he wasn't even necessarily at first trying to reach me specifically. And so, but again, so over time, over about a year, we're having these conversations where he's asking me questions about our picket signs, and I'm asking him questions about Judaism and Jewish theology. And the only reason I'm asking is I want to find better ways of countering his points. But he was the first person, after that, about a year of conversation, who found the first internal inconsistency in Westboro's doctrine. And for me, like that was absolutely the moment. That was the beginning of the end.
And what was the inconsistency?
It was actually one I realized this morning, because I went back looking at there was a couple of interviews that you had done that I wanted to, like, am I remembering this correctly? So I went and looked up a couple of them, and you mentioned it. You mentioned the death penalty for, the sign calling for the death penalty for gays. And, that was the, point that David made. I'm saying what, my uncle said to you: if that punishment is good enough for God, then it's good enough for us. That's right. What the Mosaic Code calls for. And so therefore, that's it. That's the standard. And David said, well, didn't Jesus say, let he who is without sin cast the first stone? You didn't mention that. You mentioned the other point that David made, which was, you mentioned my mom, had my oldest brother out of wedlock. And we had answers to both of those arguments. When somebody would say, let he who was without sin cast the first stone, we would say, we're not casting stones, we're preaching words. And David, again, pointed out the obvious response to that, which is, yeah, but you're advocating that the government cast stones, and who there is sinless. And then also, the point about my mother, like we would always say, she repented of that sin, and so therefore she doesn't deserve that punishment. But of course, again, if you kill somebody as soon as they sin, then they don't have the opportunity to repent and be forgiven. If you just, and so I realized, of course, that if my mother had been killed, my family wouldn't exist. The hypocrisy of it was so apparent to me. And so, yeah, it just was, I didn't know what to make of it. I decided to stop holding that sign. I went to my mother and a couple of the older people in the church and asked about this, and was just told that, I was getting wrapped around an axle. And the point is, they're not going to institute the death penalty. And I just if we were making this a litmus test, why is that? Why isn't the fact that they're not doing it, like actually, doing what Jesus said, not having, trying to kill people for their sins, giving them the opportunity to repent and be forgiven. So that, for me, that was the first time I realized that we could be wrong. I believed before that all my life there had always been an answer, something from the Bible that would explain our position. And so, yeah, this was mind-blowing for me.
Let's pause our conversation with Megan Phelps-Roper there. We will have part 2 of the interview coming up on the program tomorrow. You will also be able to see the entire interview, uncut and unedited, as I always present them to you, on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/The David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Donald Trump was confronted with more brutal chants of lock him up yesterday at a Veterans Day parade. It has not been so good for Donald Trump at public events recently, other than ones where his audience is either handpicked, like at rallies, or in deeply parts of the country, like in Alabama over the weekend. Trump went to Game 5 of the Major League Baseball World Series in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago. He was met by just relentless booing and chants of lock him up. Last week, he went to a UFC fight in New York City, also met with relentless booing. Then he went to a football game in Alabama and actually got some cheers. And then yesterday spoke at a Veterans Day parade in New York City, and it was ugly. The crowd filled with signs like impeach Trump, signs that say traitor, criminal, lock him up. And then, of course, the chants of lock him up, a throwback. By the way, I'm realizing that some people may not know what lock him up stems from. This is a throwback to the chants of lock her up, referring to Hillary Clinton over her emails. How quaint that seems now. During the 2016 Republican National Convention, you might remember now indicted former Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn was involved in leading a chant of lock her up. And we saw many others during the 2016 presidential campaign. This is Trump's hometown, New York City, and he's hated. Every public appearance is becoming one of these please clap moments for Donald Trump. And let's be really honest about the true incongruency of Trump speaking at a Veterans Day parade. I am hard pressed to think of a president less supportive of our veterans than Donald Trump. He said he'd fix the VA and veterans health care. He's not done it. He's attacked Gold Star families and gone to war with the family of deceased military captain Khizr Khan. He attacked former prisoner of war, late Senator John McCain. He said that avoiding sexually transmitted diseases from women he slept with was, quote, his own personal Vietnam, after getting a bogus doctor's note to avoid going to the real Vietnam, which, by the way, I would have done the exact same thing. That was a completely pointless and terrible military engagement. That's actually not what's at issue here. Trump wanted to use the military for his own political gain by having them go guard the border with Mexico during a completely fabricated immigrant caravan crisis, which, by the way, whatever happened to that? It's no longer politically useful, so it's simply not being mentioned. But expect that it might experience a resurgence as we get closer and closer to the November of 2020 election. He claimed to be donating money to veterans charities, got the public relations benefit of those donations, but then never actually gave the money. Aside from the fact that crowds are increasingly hostile to Donald Trump, the guy has no business whatsoever speaking at a Veterans Day parade. I can't think of, and I'm open to hearing from you, is there any other president that has been more hostile to the military and veteran community? I can't think of one, at least not recently. Hey, this is hilarious. We've not done anything like this for a while because we haven't talked about Christian televangelist Pat Robertson for a long time. He's still at it. He's hosting his 700 Club program. He's 89 years old. He still has that same co-host. He still takes these audience questions where you can't tell if they are parodies or serious questions from people who don't realize that it doesn't make any sense to go to Pat Robertson for advice. I was sent this clip yesterday where someone said, David, you've got to see this. Pat Robertson got a question from some guy who claims that his wife wants to bring in their Christian pastor as her extra lover. She wants to swing, or she wants an open relationship or something with her pastor. And the husband went to Pat Robertson asking, what should I do? So when I heard about this before even watching the clip, I was wondering, is Pat Robertson going to take it seriously, or will he identify it as a fake trolling question? I don't know if it's a joke or if it's for real, but what I knew immediately was if Pat Robertson takes it seriously, he is going to attribute his wife's behavior, the viewer's wife's behavior, to demons. Because with Pat Robertson, everything is demonic. Over the last 10 years on this program, Pat Robertson has called the following things demonic. Secondhand sweaters that you get at Goodwill. They could have demons attached to them from the previous owner. Ouija boards, yoga, anything Harry Potter, feng shui, I guess it's Japanese interior design technique, karate, the martial art, horoscopes, the Twilight series, paintings of Buddha, TV shows about ghosts, Halloween, obviously, psychics, young girls who levitate their friends at sleepovers, definitely demonic, and sometimes even children that you adopt from other countries can come with demons attached, according to Pat Robertson. So let's get right into the clip. How does he handle it? Exactly as predicted.
This is Michael Pat, who says, Dear Pat, I've been married to my wife for 8 years, and we are very active in our local church. Last week, she shocked me when she said she wants our pastor to be her, quote, extra lover. This does not make any sense since I give her all the love and compassion that I can give. Our pastor does not know her plan. Should I talk to him first before she tells him?
Oh, you'd better talk to somebody. That is the weirdest thing.
Psychologically
well, I think there's a sex problem. She has been captured probably by some demonic spirit. But what she's saying, she's married to you, has a successful marriage with you. You give her whatever she wants, but she wants a, quote, extra lover. Mm-hmm. Where does she get that concept?
Yep, there it is. It's demonic possession for sure. I love how he diagnoses demonic possession in the same casual way that a plumber tells you the flapper on your toilet needs to be replaced. It's like the exact same demeanor. Oh yeah, that's demonic possession. That's what that is. Then this is also funny. Later in the clip, the co-host seems visibly shocked that someone who's active in a Christian church could also be wanting to have sex with her pastor outside of marriage. Take a look.
Mm-hmm. Where does she get that concept? That is absolutely wrong.
And she's active in her local church, so she obviously should know that.
Being active in a church really doesn't mean anything much. It just means you're active. It doesn't mean necessarily, you're given over to the Lord. You need to talk to that pastor, mm-hmm. and you need to alert him to what's going on, and then you need to get that wife to some kind of counseling and deliverance, because she's being captured by something that sounds extremely evil, all right?
Pat Robertson actually correct here. I mean, listen, he's completely out of his mind, but he's right. Just being active in a Christian church doesn't make you anything. And he could not be more right about that one little thing, a broken clock right, I guess once every few decades in this case. It sounds to me like the wife needs a good old-fashioned exorcism to solve this problem. So what do you think? Is this fake or not? I mean, on the one hand, who would even write to Pat Robertson with a problem like this? Like who thinks that Pat Robertson could solve any problem? But at the same time, he's still going. He's still on air. So there must be some people that see Pat Robertson as a purveyor of good, sound advice, which may be the scariest thing of all. I want to hear from you. Leave a reply, leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube, or send me a tweet at dpacman after following me, of course. Do you think that this was a serious question, or is this just a satirical troll? Speaking of satirical trolls, we have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2DavidP. I am going to play a voicemail for you today. It is very short. It's only 15 seconds long. This is either one of our most uninformed callers ever, or an absolutely genius satirical voice actor. This, I think, is related to recent conversations about how educated versus uneducated white voters vote in American elections. Take a listen to this. You be the judge. Most ignorant caller ever or brilliant satirical voice actor.
So, hey, you weasel-headed little sucker, just because us white people ain't educated like you dumb suckers that think you are educated, this is racial discrimination. Maybe we ought to send you back to Poland. Thank you.
So I would think it's real, except send me back to Poland. I don't know where that came from. So I don't know. You tell me. Let me know either by replying if you're watching on YouTube or shoot me a tweet at dpacman. Was that real or was that satire? On today's bonus show, ex-Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick is reportedly exploring a late entry into the 2020 Democratic primary. Now, you will remember, some of you will remember, that Deval Patrick has been a good friend to the David Pakman Show. I've interviewed him a couple of times, despite the fact that he would always call me Mark, not David. That's okay. Busy guy. He has been pretty good in terms of making himself available to the David Pakman Show when he was governor, and he is an interesting potential entrant with some pretty status quo corporatist stuff in his background, including being the lawyer for Coca-Cola. So we will talk about that on today's bonus show. We will talk about Amazon launching a new grocery store as an alternative to Whole Foods. But hold on, Amazon bought Whole Foods. Now they're going to compete with Whole Foods. Don't worry. I'll explain it all on the bonus show. And a viral video, a black man handcuffed for eating a sandwich at a train station. Officials are now apologizing for what was a really cringy interaction on the behalf of the police officer, I will mention. We will discuss all of those stories and much, much more on today's bonus show. 2 ways to get access to the bonus show. Number 1, become a member. Go to www.joinpacman.com. Click the red sign up button. Takes under a minute. You'll be in on the bonus show. Second option, go to patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Become a patron at least the $5 a month level. You will also get instant access to that world famous bonus show hosted by me Monday through Thursday, hosted by producer Pat on Fridays. Last Friday, or maybe the one before, producer Pat had a story about his pants getting stolen. How could his pants get stolen right off of his body? Well, maybe it didn't go down exactly that way. You can find out on the bonus show. I will speak to you then in just a few short moments.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.